Okay, hello BookTube. Um, this video I want to try and introduce my Western Canon reading list. It's a video that I've been wanting to do for a while, but it's a difficult video to do because it's a big list and I didn't know exactly how I would approach introducing it in a video format. It's easier just to send the PDF file to people and they can read it for themselves. But I guess I wanted to premise this by kind of giving some background about how I came up with my Western Canon reading list. Um, well, for a long time now, probably a few years, I've been really interested in reading classics. And mostly that meant for me reading classic novels, like Victorian era and around like before that and sometime after that, some 20th century classics. But within the last year or so, I've gotten really interested in, or more than a year at least, I got really interested in nonfiction and nonfiction classics, and that just kind of branched out into wanting to read the Western canon classics to begin with, like all the Western classics, or at least the most influential ones. And so last November, not this November 2022, but November of 2021, my university, that's usually one of the most busiest months of the year for me at the university, but my professors went on strike that month. And so I had a whole month of no classes, and there really wasn't much to do because we didn't have access to our online stuff or online materials that was part of the strike. And so I spent over a course of just under a week, I think. I basically consulted a bunch of Western canon lists, um, and did a lot of my own research, and came up with a list of classics, a really long list of books that I would like to go through in sequential order, starting all the way back from the beginning, and kind of just working my way up to about the mid to the 3/4 point of the 20th century, so around the 70s and 80s. I think I have some that might be a little bit older or newer than that, but not a whole lot. And yeah, so that's kind of the small story. The lists I consulted, there's the Harvard Classics series from over 100 years ago. I looked at that list, and I looked at the list. What was it? Harold Bloom. He has his own list, which was really, really detailed and unnecessarily so. And so I kind of just picked picked the most influential ones that I've found on his list. And then the there was the Great Reading, or was it the Great Books? I think from Britannica from the 50s. Um, I consulted those lists, and then of course the BookTube king, Steve Donahue. He did a wonderful video series on the Western Canon Starter Kit, which I really took to heart as kind of like the foundation for how I made my list. So I basically took all his recommendations, listed them, and kind of built around that. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and then I will kind of read the first page. Or I have my first page here has my explaining how the list works, and then my goals. And I will actually leave a link to this entire PDF in the description, so you can look at it and steal from it whatever you want. But I would like to read this because it gives it explains more succinctly the logic behind my list. So I'll start from the beginning. I'll explain how the list works. Everything in square brackets, usually labeled maybe, are books I won't be reading on my initial read along. They are there because I felt like I couldn't leave them off, although I do hope to get to them later when I go through the list again, or when I go back through the list and revisit it. Number 2, stuff labeled must buy are books I don't own yet. The ones without a label are ones I already own. Almost everything in square brackets is also included in the must buy list. Number 3, I tried to go through groupings instead of strict chronology. So Greek literature and Roman literature are mostly separate, and American and English literature, etc., in different time periods. So within, say, 100 years, I'll group the American and the English and whatnot. Not that I have like from Chaucer to Shakespeare to the Victorian era all in one lump. No, that is separated. It's not all like that, but when it makes sense to, I try to stick to it. So, for example, the 19th century, with American and Victorian classics and French classics, those are mostly separated based on country. And number 4, I place a greater emphasis on selected works edited in one volume instead of reading complete volumes, so that I can read the more important pieces from a wider selection or section of works from each writer instead of sifting through 5 major works just to get similar information. And this applies mostly to philosophers. I'm not reading abridged novels. And for example, the biggest examples in my mind of that are, for example, Hegel and Kant. But I do have some examples here I'd like to show. Here is Jean-Paul Sartre's Basic Writings, edited by Stephen Priest. This is published by Routledge, and it's just over 330 pages. And this I felt like would be a lot better to kind of get an essence of Jean-Paul Sartre as a philosopher and as a writer, instead of having to plow my way through Being and Nothing, which is like, what, 700 pages of nothing? But it's still considered influential. And I believe this this book takes selections from that. And so I felt like that was a better way to approach writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, instead of actually forcing my way through a 700-page book, philosophy book, I guess. Though there is some exceptions to that. Another example is this one I found used at a used bookstore, the Marx and Engels Reader, 2nd edition, edited by Robert Tucker. This one I intended to. There was an Oxford selected edition of Marx, just Marx, not Marx and Engels, of Marx's work. It's like 700 pages, and I was initially gonna go for that, but it's published by Oxford University Press, and it's like $50, which is a lot. And so finding this at a used bookstore, I just might as well go with this instead, because this is pretty hefty itself. This one's almost over 750 pages, but includes Engels as well. And another one is the Erasmus Reader by University of Toronto, and it's edited by Erika Rummel. If you don't know, University of Toronto is actually publishing basically the complete works of Erasmus in like 80 plus volumes, like the complete works in translation, I should add, with heavily footnoted. And so basically what this book does, it's not finished yet, but this book I think is from the 90s or something. It's been going since the 70s at least. But yeah, late 90s, early to late 90s. This editor, Erika Rummel, basically took some of the more influential pieces of Erasmus and kind of put them in an anthology like this. But the sad thing is that she did not put the complete Praise of Folly in here, so I had to get another anthology. This is the Norton Critical edition of the Praise of Folly and Other Writings by Erasmus, but selected, translated, and edited by Robert M. Adams. This one includes the entire Praise of Folly and some other selections from his writings. Ones that are not in here, and just another editorial look at Erasmus, even though this one certainly has a lot more selections in it. That's just an example of some of the selected works that what I kind of mean. I'm not doing that with all of them. For example, I'll be reading complete works of Plato and Aristotle, and some of the more actual influential books in their entirety. It's basically based on how much I'm willing to read of that one author. Because like for Kant or for Hegel, I'm not reading their entire influential books. Like that's just not something I'm interested in enough right now. But anyway, I'm going to read out my goals for this list. I've been a lover of literature, a love of literature in general, and when I realized how much literature in each, I've always been a lover of literature in general, and when I realized how much literature in each era relies on the works of the past, I really became interested in reading the most influential works of the Western canon. This is my attempt at learning and hopefully loving the history of literature. Another motive is my interest in political philosophy, which is a relatively new interest, and to a lesser extent, philosophy in general. It is my opinion that the ideas that have shaped past governments and cultures is crucial to understanding my own period in history. I want to read what so many thinkers before me have read and found important, and how it contributed to Western ideas. Regardless if philosophers like Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, Kant, Hegel, and many others were playing philosophic word games, these ideas have been interpreted and reinterpreted in ways that have affected how people see themselves and other people, and how governments treat their people and other nations. I've always thought that ideas have consequences, and all these writers and thinkers listed here have contributed to history's conversation that have birthed my present day. I want to immerse myself in this conversation, and the biggest goal is to understand how Western society grew and evolved through its literature and philosophy leading up to today. Which is kind of true. I mean, I stopped at a certain point. I didn't even go up to my birth. So putting today there is maybe sort of misleading, but you know what I mean. You can only call something a classic and part of the Western canon up to a certain point. And I want it to be a little bit more realistic in that. To continue, I do intend to read secondary literature that adds to this conversation, but that is my main priority. I wanted to read the words of real people in history trying to make sense of their situation. Hopefully, I can get more from secondary literature once I've read their source material. So instead of reading books on the history of literature, or books on the history of philosophy, or the history of political philosophy or political science, which I have enormous shelf space devoted to, I have not read many of them, mostly because I want to read the actual works first. I know most people do it the opposite way. They read like a history of political thought or something, and then they read the books that were talked about. I mean, and I'm okay with doing that as well, but this is a project that has been sitting in the weeds for almost a year already, and I think if I try to read some of those books now, it'll just kind of it'll stop me from getting to this list and actually making headway. So I think I'm gonna explain some of my decisions here, some of the logic of what. First, I'm gonna start with the very beginning. The very beginning, I start off with Homer, and I finished the Odyssey in October, and this month I've been reading the Iliad, which I'm almost done. Got about 30 pages left, so I'll finish this today. But and then my next book on the list is The Myths of Mesopotamia, and I included the Iliad and Odyssey first because I wanted to start off the Western canon starter kit on a fun note, if that makes sense. Because I'm not sure how fun it will be to read this. This includes the Epic of Gilgamesh and some other shorter epics from the same period, and a lot of them are just we're missing so much that we don't get a full narrative. We just get words, and then we get like a big chopped out chunk and a lot of gaps. So this, I don't know how fun this will be to read and enjoy. And I didn't want to start off on a bad note. I know we have Homer in his entirety, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I read the Iliad last year or the year before, I can't remember. Before in a different translation, and so reading the Iliad again is a treat, I think. So, but then, if you can see my screen, I call it the early Greek age, and I go from Epic of Gilgamesh, Hesiod, Homeric hymns, Aesop's fables, some philosophers, two that I'm really looking forward to, Herodotus and Thucydides, Xenophon, and then I got the playwrights. Then I get Plato and Aristotle. I do need to go through Aristotle yet and see exactly which works I'm going to read from Aristotle. I think my baseline will be that modern library, big fat edition of the basic works of Aristotle. I'm not going to buy a copy of that because it's just going to be. I'm trying to be cost conscious with my book purchasing for this list, and so I'll be reading as much public domain works as possible, and we have a lot of good translations of Aristotle in the public domain. So I'll be taking that basic works of modern library, and they have selections from certain Aristotle works, and then they have a chunk of them in their entirety. So I'll basically just take those works that they have in their entirety and read the same work in a different translation, in a free translation. So basically, I'm stealing that editorial decision of what they think as the basic works of Aristotle are, and then just reading them on my own through either Project Gutenberg or Delphi Classics, which is a classics ebook publisher that I really enjoy. They take the complete works of an author and then they stick it into one entire ebook, and then so one big fat ebook, or fat in the relative sense, in the ebook sense. And so I have all of Aristotle on ebook, and I can just kind of pick through what I think is most important to read, and then I'll just read the entire one, read the entire book, or read that certain work, and then that ends off the early Greek age, and then I go into the Latin age with some Roman playwrights, Julius Caesar, Cicero. Cicero is another weird one because he doesn't have, those 2 or 3 must-read classical or influential works. It seems like the entire corpus of Cicero is just been picked apart. Unlike with Plato and Aristotle, where you have like those 3 or 4 works that are like essential Plato books to read and Aristotle books to read. So then I had to go through, and Penguin and Oxford both publish a lot of Cicero, and so even like minor books that haven't been that weren't widely read as much, but there's Cicero, and so they publish a lot of them. So I just took I basically tried to research which ones were the most influential and labeled them here. Some of them, if you can see my mouse on the screen, some of them are labeled in Latin. That's because that's how my ebook, the Delphi Classics Complete Works of Cicero, that's how they label them. So that'll be all the Cicero that I'll be reading, and then including a pseudo-Cicero, which is also, I think this one is on rhetoric, which was an influential work that was previously assumed to be a work by Cicero. Yeah, and then we got some poets here, Lucretius, Catullus, and Horace, Virgil, Ovid. We got Seneca. I have Seneca all in ebook as well, so I need to update this, but I just haven't gotten around to it. And then you can see here with Josephus and Juvenal and Quintilian that we are moving into the 1st century AD. And then with Plutarch, I'll be reading the entire Plutarch. The Delphi Classics edition has the Bernadette Perrin translation, which is the Harvard Classics, or the Harvard Classics, or the Loeb Classics, Loeb Classical Library. That's what I'm thinking of. This is their translation. It's an old translation from like the 20s and 30s. But since I'm in Canada, I have the whole thing in public domain. And so I'm going to be starting with that one. And if it's just too dry, I'll move on to the Dryden translation. And then Plutarch's essays. I want to go, so I'm going to skip all this all the way up to, I think I'm going to explain as I get, you see Reformation, Middle Ages, the English Renaissance, and 1600s, 1700s. I want to go to the 1800s and explain some of my maybes here. So now, as I get to the 1800s, now we got the printing becomes more, books become more widespread. So we get the incoming of the novel, and the novel is already becoming established, and we got just a wave of literature that really the previous centuries did not have as much, especially since it's becoming more affordable for people to, and more desirable as a pastime to pick up volumes and read. And so I had to make some editorial decisions. As you see, as I read in my goals, the goals was to read literature, because novels is my main passion as my early reading, my early childhood reading. And so novels are my thing. And then it's only been recently that I've been interested in philosophy and political philosophy and that kind of nonfiction. So the problem is with poetry. Up to this point, poetry has been hugely influential, but it's been something like you can't miss Chaucer, you can't miss Dante in the Divine Comedy, you can't miss Shakespeare, even though he's a playwright, but lots of poetry in his plays. You can't miss that kind of thing. But for the 1800s, I've made the decision to cut out a lot of the poetry in this age. So if you see here, I have Keats, Shelley, and Byron all in brackets. They're all maybes. So when I go through and I get to the 1800s, I will not be reading their works. I will not be. I have an idea of what I would like to read. So I have like the complete poems, major works, and stuff. Coleridge and Wordsworth are also maybes. So I'll be passing over all of their poetry, even though their poetry is very influential. And that's because poetry is not my main reading entertainment or what I want to get from the Western canon. I'm willing to read very influential poetry, which is why I read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and I have a lot of the main poets from, the Latin and Greek poets, or Latin poets, like Ovid and Virgil and um, Lucretius and stuff. But when I get to the 1800s, the 1800s is really stuffed with literature. So we have a ton of novels, a ton of political works, a lot of philosophy. It's just uh, how many pages? It's what, half a page here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5 pages. So basically we have 5 pages if we take that other half and kind of suit it in here. So basically 5 pages of the 18th century. Wait, do I have this wrong? I do. It's not the 18th century, it's the 19th century. I'm sorry about that. The 1800s. Yeah, so I have this right, 1800s, but it's the 19th century. I know that. Okay, so the 19th century. And so I have a lot of novels. So I have the Tocqueville. I have John Stuart Mill. I have I think I have the complete Jane Austen. Yeah, right here, the complete works of Jane Austen. I'll be reading. Emerson, Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe. I'll be reading. I have a big vintage paperback of his complete works, fiction works mostly, and poetry. Though I don't know if I'll be reading his poetry. Probably not. And then I have Balzac, Hugo, and Dumas, Marx, Hawthorne, and Melville, and yeah, Alcott, Cooper, Mark Twain. And so as you can see, even Trollope is a maybe. I don't have Trollope here as an influential. He's very entertaining to read, and a lot of the classic lines like Penguin and Oxford published a lot of his works. But Dickens here I have as a priority. So I have the Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Bleak House, Hard Times, Oliver Twist, Tale of Two Cities, and Great Expectations. These are all like essential Dickens works that kind of that have entered into the Western canon as major works. And so I'll be way more busy with this kind of thing, with even here with Darwin and influential Russian works like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. That's a lot to read, a lot of fiction, and I'm trying to look for political works, but I don't see. Oh, here we go. We got Nietzsche, we got Schopenhauer, even the complete Sherlock Holmes. I have a 2-volume hardcover set of the complete works of Sherlock Holmes. I'll be reading all of that. Yeah, William James, Henry James. I got a lot of Henry James as well. And so I had to make the decision to cut out, like, even here I have Tennyson, I have Barrett Browning and Robert Browning. All 3 of those are all maybes. Even George Eliot, I just have Middlemarch, and then a lot of her other works, or all of her other works, all put as maybes. So I had to make editorial decisions of what to cut out, and even I cut out major historical works too of this time period, like Gibbon, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I had to cut out what was it, Macaulay, and yeah, uh, yeah. What was it, the Russian or not the Russian, the French Revolution? That's a historical, an influential historical work. There's or maybe that's Carlyle. I think that's Carlyle. And then Macaulay's History of England. I cut both of those works out as well. Though I keep in early historical works like Bede. I have Bede on my list. I have as we saw Herodotus and Thucydides. But then political works is one of the major themes. So I include lesser known, nowadays we consider them lesser known political works that were influential in their time. And one of the great lines is, I have two prompts here. The Cambridge texts in the history of political thought. So, for example, I have Pufendorf. This is on the duty of man and citizen. And if I go on my screen and go all the way up to Pufendorf's age, he was 1600s, so that would be the 17th century. After, okay, yeah, 1600s. He's a German who wrote mostly in Latin, I think. So Pufendorf was influential for guys like John Locke. And this tiny volume is only a fraction of what Pufendorf actually wrote. Like, I think, was it the Liberty Fund or something, publishes like the 5-volume work of Pufendorf's that he had, and then this was kind of this basically touches on the same subjects, but with a lot more brevity. And so this is why this is in the Cambridge line, and that big work is not. And that big work too, with the 5-volume, I forget what it's called. It's something similar to this, because I know this isn't an abridgment of that. This is an actual work that he wrote after, I think, but on a similar subject. And that work does not have a new translation. It's a translation right from that modern day. This one is a new translation. But I can't find Pufendorf here. I know he's here somewhere. Right here, on the duty of man. And that big 5-volume work I was talking about is Of the Laws of Nature and Citizens. And they also publish Whole Duty of Man, which I think, I don't know how many volumes that is. It might be just one. Might be just one volume. But if you can see here on my screen share, Milton also has, I call them blue Cambridge texts, because Cambridge also has a green Cambridge text, which I did not take out. I have one volume of that, where it's basically the history of philosophy, not political philosophy. So the blue is history of philosophy, or history of political philosophy, or political thought, and then the green Cambridge texts are the history of philosophy and philosophical thinking. So John Milton, he has a volume called Political Writings of Milton's political writing or political work. But another one that I have 4, I think, but I have 2 that I'm showing you. This one is Montesquieu, The Spirit of the Laws, and this is the first big fat complete translation in a really long time. I think they say on the back, first complete English language edition since 1750. And that's a really long time, because this 1750 is around when this came out. Let's see if I can find it here, right here, Montesquieu. He also has the Parisian letters, but this is a political work that I'll be reading. I'll read this in the entirety. Even though Montesquieu is not like a household name when you think just offhand of political thinkers, you think of the guys that were influenced by Montesquieu, because Montesquieu does absolutely have, I think even in, he's an important figure in the Enlightenment, and had an influence upon those who framed the American Constitution. So these kind of like lesser known characters that still have a lot of influence are the ones that I did a lot of research in trying to find. Not all of them have recent editions, and so you can only go so far, which is the case with Erasmus too. He's not as well known anymore, even though he was at one point one of the most famous authors in Europe, or most popular in Europe. And I think the adages of Erasmus are really hard to find, even though they were a major bestseller in his days. And I think these, I don't even know if these include any of his adages, but I'm not entirely. No, I don't think so. This contains most of just his political and satirical writing. Yeah, so, and now I'll explain another aspect of the Western Canon starter kit that I wanted to include, but I had to take out. And to do that, I'll go to the 1500s. I wanted to include, as you imagine, the Greek and Roman writers were, of course, quite influential throughout the ages, but going along like through the Middle Ages, and then you get the English and Italian Renaissance, and then you get the Reformation, you get the Reformation, and then you get the English Renaissance. You get not everyone can read the originals of these Greek and Roman writers, and so you have to get works in translation. And so here in the 1500s, you get the very first translations of these major works into English. And so I included on my list initially Golding, I think it's William Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses. And then you got Thomas North's translation of Plutarch, his entire translation of Plutarch. And these two works were, of course, they're largely considered to be the work that Shakespeare used. He used these translations, Golding's translation of Metamorphoses, and then selected some of the works of Plutarch that Thomas North translated. And so then these translations have great influence in themselves. Same here, I have George Chapman, his Chapman's Iliad and Odyssey. I had all of these listed in, and I have going through the ages too. I think I have, as a maybe, I have Florio's translation of Montesquieu, early in the 1600s, like 2 or 3, like what, 1602 or 1603, somewhere in there. Florio published the complete essays of Montaigne in an English translation, and then Shakespeare also was influenced by those translations. And so translations can have their own influence, because I don't know, you probably, if you have a Greek or Latin scholar, or even with Montaigne, a French scholar, I think he wrote in French, they would not consider these old translations as particularly accurate, but they have an influence in themselves. And so I really wanted to include as many of those translations on my list as possible. But because of the length of my list, the enormous length, I don't even know how many I have on here. I've never really counted how long my list is for actual like books that I'll be reading and authors. But there had to be one exception, and I want to talk about that exception, and that is the Bible. So, because the Bible, I have the Bible situated in its time period roughly. I have it after the Greek and Latin classics. So I have the Bible after Plutarch, even though the Bible was, of course, kind of put together. The New Testament was written before, arguably before, even if it was just before Plutarch, because Plutarch was writing in the late 1st century AD and early 2nd century AD. And for my initial reading of the Bible, I'll be reading the entire Bible. I have this ESV edition that I'll be reading, just a modern translation, just to get me through. I've read a good chunk of the Bible anyway, but I have not read it from front to back. So this will be the edition that I read when I reach the Bible in the first time in my in my Western Canon reading list. But then then I made the exception and put the King James Bible as a translation that I will be reading a second time. It's the only book that actually appears a second time in a translation, or as another translation. So I have the King James Bible. I'll be reading the Penguin Classic. I don't have a copy of it yet, but the Penguin Classic has the King James Bible in its entirety. And what I like about it is that they have it in prose. So I have a King James Bible. I don't know. It's right up there somewhere. I have a King James Bible, but it's in just chunks. So each verse is like its own little chunk, and it's like double column and everything. I don't like that about Bibles. I like it even uh, this Bible changes that up too. So as you can see, it's in paragraphs, which is what I prefer out of a formatting of anything really, not just the Bible. And so that's an exception that I made. I know I'm getting long-winded, and this has probably been extremely boring, but it's something I really wanted to kind of it's a video I really want to make because a lot of the videos I make from here on in will be discussing the Western Canon reading list. Which brings me to the last thing that I wanted to talk about, which is my focus for this Western Canon reading list. My initial focus was to take this really slowly, or as slowly as I was comfortable doing it. I think I'm gonna exit out of sharing. There we go. So my initial focus was to take it slow, to savor Homer, to savor the Epic of Gilgamesh, and to savor Thucydides and Aristotle. So I would take the time and the work just to understand them on their own terms, and so I would read stuff online to help me understand. For example, Aristotle is going to be difficult. I won't understand everything I read the first time through. And so I was going to take it slow so that I could understand Aristotle and what he's saying, and kind of follow his train of thought. And even for, Marx or the other philosophers on my list, or Montesquieu that I have, or Pufendorf, I really wanted to be my first reading of the Western Canon reading list to be a deep dive. But then I watched Brandon at Brandon's Bookshelf. I watched his video introducing the Harvard Classics, which he has the entire set in hardcover, which is a really nice set. And he said that after he bought it, he read it within a year, which I found is quite impressive. And it really made me reconsider what I want my Western Canon starter kit, or my Western Canon reading list to be. Now I've reconsidered it so that I want my first read through to be just a lighter reading, so that I won't get stuck in the weeds of Aristotle or Plato. So that it's okay when I'm reading someone like Marx or something. It's okay if I don't understand his argument, because Marx is famous for being extremely dense. And if I take that time to really wrestle with Marx the first time through, to really try to understand him, chances are I'll never finish. I'll be 40 years old by the time I finish my Western Canon reading list, and I don't want this list to take 20 years. So I've refocused my priority of this list so that it's a faster read through, so that I have the entire list, or all the works under my belt. I've read them once through, and even if I don't understand them, I at least have a familiarity with some of the issues they bring up so that I can go back and reread certain sections, certain things that I encounter in other literature, and I can have a more solid footing in the Western canon. So even with the Bible or some of these examples here, I have a bunch of examples beside me that I was going to show on camera, but I don't know how long this video is. I may have to do that in another video. I think, why not? I'll just do it now. So this first one, I basically have a big stack of some of the more crazy examples on my Western canon list that I want to read through. And this one here is The City of God by St. Augustine. So instead of trying to sit here and try to study Augustine from front to back, all 1,000 pages of St. Augustine, The City of God, I'll just take this and I'll read it, and I'll be okay with not understanding him right away. The understanding will come if I ever, when or if I decide to reread St. Augustine. Then I can take it slow. Then I can really get into the weeds of what he is saying, because I know I've read the entire work, so I have at least a little familiarity than if I tried to read him without knowing what comes next. I don't know the ends of his arguments when I read it the first time, and so it makes study or deep dive into St. Augustine really difficult, because I don't have the familiarity that I would have if I did in fact read him all the way through just once, with being okay with not understanding a good chunk of it, and moving on to something else. Because if I did that slow read through, I would never get through this list, and I would never get through Augustine, because there's whole university departments that are dedicated to reading books like this just over and over and over again. I think that's it. That's all I really wanted to cover. I guess I will share some of my more ambitious books that I have on my Western canon list. Ones that are some of them are fairly obvious, but I'm going through but not. And these are the ones that I own physical copies of. So I think we'll start with. I showed you Saint Augustine, but now this one I have is the three-volume Arabian Nights. This is the Penguin Classic 3-volume Arabian Nights, so volume 1, 2, and 3. I'll be reading this entire thing for the Western Canon reading list. I know there is probably like a million abridgments of this work that are probably just fine. I could easily get away with reading them. Reading like a 500-page abridgment and getting some of the more influential stories, but get 3-volume work has really appealed to me, mostly because, I mean, this one volume, this is volume one, and it alone is over 800 pages. So you can see, like, if you take an abridgment of, I don't know, like, what's the entire page count? Probably over 2,000 pages of this, and you abridge it into 500 pages. You're taking a lot away from this as a work, from this work, and what the I don't know how all the stories connect. I don't know if I haven't even started reading this. I don't know if they even connect all that well. And I do know that there was a famous, I don't know if it was famous, but there was a Victorian translation of the entire work, which the editors of this edition really do mention. They mention, maybe I should look for it. Or the translator. Yeah, it's Richard Burton, his famous translation from 1885 to 1888. That translation, I think I included as a maybe on my Western canon list as well. because it was the entirety of the Arabian Nights. But yeah, I'll be reading those 3 volumes. Another probably less crazy, but still to me it seems really crazy. The complete works of Shakespeare. Normally people, I mean, I'm sure I could get away with just reading the most famous works of Shakespeare, but I mean, look at the size of this thing. This is double column. I mean, this has a lot of editorial material as well, and a really long introduction, and a lot of notes. And I've read a lot of Shakespeare already. I think I've read almost 20 of his plays already, and he published almost 40, so 38-ish, and all of them are in here. And this also includes his poetry. But I find this crazy because this volume itself is over 1,500 pages. And even just reading, when I took a Shakespeare class last year, I found out I had a lot of fatigue from reading Shakespeare. So it'll be interesting to see how I get through the complete works, just from front to back. I'll be reading it from front to back. I won't be dipping in. I intend to read this and just go through the entire thing. I don't want to take my time. Maybe that's a mistake. Maybe I'll end up regretting that. I don't, and I don't want the idea. I don't want to give off the idea that I'll be just breezing through. No, I'm a relatively slow reader, so when I say I'll just going through that entire thing, this book will probably take me at least 2 months, if not more, depending on when I end up reading it. Another crazy book. This one is probably the most crazy one on the list, but it's the original Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Penguin publishes this big fat edition, which is deceiving because it's not actually this long. I think it ends up, the actual work ends around here. So this all the way up to here. This is actually all of Chaucer. The rest, this is all editorial notes and a glossary. And this is like introduction, 100-page introduction. But the caveat that this is Chaucer in his original language. So this is Middle English Chaucer. It does give you help at the bottom, as you can, if you see at the very bottom here, it does give you help for each tale, or for that page. But yeah, I don't know how to read this. I don't know how to read it at all. And I did read the Neville Cogtail, or Coghill, or however you pronounce his last name. I read that translation this past January, 2022, so almost a year ago. And I, to say the least, I was not a fan. And but then again, I had this edition as well, and so there were times where I was comparing the translation to this work, and it was interesting to see the differences, just the liberties that Coghill had to make, because Coghill's translation is in verse, and so he makes it rhyme as much as possible. And I think that was the main reason why I didn't like it, because it took away, I think, he was trying to force Chaucer using his conventions of his language into, our conventions with our language. And I didn't enjoy it very much. And so this looks like reading suicide. But I'm gonna do it. I think it'll be fun too. Another book that will be crazy is The Entire Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser. And this book is, he wrote in a deliberately archaic verse style, canto, in cantos. And as you can see, this is a very, very long work, and this edition as well keeps the original spelling of Edmund Spenser because, from what I understand, the original spelling of Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene is important because he kind of, well, he's very influenced by the archaic language of Chaucer himself. And so if I can get through this and I can learn how to pronounce to a decent degree, then this should be more of a breeze. But still, this I believe is going to be a lot slower going than Chaucer, because Chaucer is just, he's like witty and faster paced, I think, than what this will be, because this is more highbrow literature. Like virtue and chivalry, and well, Chaucer kind of makes fun of that in the Canterbury Tales. Two more, and then I'll be done rambling. This one is the complete 3-volume set of the Gulag Archipelago. So I'll be reading this entire thing as well. And as you can see, my middle volume does not match up. And there's nothing I can do about it. I think this bottom one here are UK editions, and then this one here is an American edition. So these pink, and this one's red. But yeah, this I can't imagine will be fun to read. It's just heavy going, I bet. But I wanted the entire 3-volume set. I did not want the abridged edition, because this is something that I find it is very influential, but I don't know how many people actually have ever read the entire thing before. But still, I found it's an important, especially in the 20th century. I kind of move into reading books that reflect the era as well. So I don't know how influential this is now, but it reflects the historical era in which he was writing, and it dives deeper into a lot of the atrocities of the period that he was writing in and what he experienced. And so I found that that's the type of thing that I want to read for the Western Canon list, because you can't dispute that this is a classic. I don't think you can dispute that this is a classic. And the last one is Thomas Pynchon, the novel Gravity's Rainbow. And I don't know how influential this is, but I took this novel as kind of a representative for the postmodern novel, because this is probably the most popular or widely known example of postmodern literature. And it's a thick novel that's going to be completely incomprehensible, and from what I hear, pretty dirty. So basically, like reading Chaucer all over again. Maybe Chaucer's rolling in his grave now that I compared him to Pynchon. But that's it. Sorry for going so long, for rambling, but it's a video that I've wanted to do for a while, and I thought it was only fair to give an idea about what it is and why I'm doing it, and some of the examples on my list. And yeah, I'll leave the link to the PDF below. Thank you.